fact, what I was going to do was to define fascism. Because fascism is this term that everyone throws around. But we need to raise the stakes, because the stakes are pretty high and dangerous. So the question is, like, what do we know as fascism? And the definition of fascism that I'm presenting is a left definition. A definition of radicals. And who are radicals? Radicals get a bad rap. But ultimately, the term radical means grasping at the roots. What makes us radical is that we want to identify the root causes of social problems and present transformative solutions, which means revolution, really is what it means. Capitalism is not capable of addressing our problems, meeting our needs, and in fact, it is in such a deep crisis that it is presenting fascism as an alternative. So what is fascism? It's a form of government that emerges in the context of three conditions which threaten the social order. So three things are in place, actually four, and I'll talk about the fourth one in a minute. Deep economic crisis, and that's not something that we can underestimate. I'm going to talk about the depth of that crisis a little later on. It's deep crisis alongside of widespread discontent. People are angry. People feel betrayed. People see no way out. And fascism has emerged, usually, in the context of a challenge to the social order presented by organized labor, by workers that are clamoring for a revolutionary alternative like communism or socialism, which is a huge threat to capitalism. So in many ways, fascism is a government of last resort, welcomed in by the capitalist ruling class, which hands over the reins of governance to the captains of industry and corporations. So it is a merger of the government and corporations as if that weren't already the case. But it's an absolute merger of government and corporation. And it's important for us to take a step back and consider what the corporation is. The corporation is the most fascistic entity in society. Because what happens to you if you break the rules in a corporation or you undermine its bottom line? You're out. There's no democracy in a corporation. There's one objective, and that is profit. And the organization, the corporation, is hierarchically organized to meet that need of profit. So this merger of government and corporate power exerts absolutely total control over labor and production under fascism. It suspends civil society, and it eliminates any and all rights. This is why I think it's important to say that we cannot compare previous democratic candidates and situations with the current one. There is a difference, for example, between McCain and Trump. Trump is a proto-fascist, self-identified candidate. He has Mein Kampf, which is a book written by Hitler called My Struggle, on his bedside. And everybody knows that. He's a self-proclaimed fascist. And so I don't think it's helpful to actually say that Kamala and Trump are both birds of the same feather. They're not. That doesn't mean that Kamala is our friend, but Trump is a self-proclaimed fascist who wants authoritarianism to reign in the federal government. Okay, so that's fascism. But this is what differentiates fascism from dictatorship or authoritarianism, and this is where the danger comes in. Fascism relies on self-armed citizens to carry out its interests. And it's also important to say that fascist movements, historically, if you look at them in the United States, in Europe, in Latin America, and all over the world, they're usually led by what is known as the petty bourgeoisie. Small shop owners, vulnerable small capitalists who work really hard. Small business owners usually work like 16-hour days in their little small bodega. They are very individualistic and they rise and fall on their own individual labor. They're usually very strict, very religious, and very disciplined, because if they're not disciplined, a small business owner will go to hell in a handbasket at the drop of a dime. So it's that class that's usually vulnerable in times of economic crisis, that small capitalist class that tends to attach itself to fascist ideology. But even though it's the petty bourgeoisie that is attracted to these ideas, all of society and the working class is vulnerable to being persuaded and inspired by these ideas. But what I want to say here, and this really comes out of an article I wrote, is that what distinguishes fascism from authoritarianism is that authoritarian rule concentrates power at the top. The dictator decides how violence is going to be deployed. Under fascism, the state relies on armed citizens to carry out the interests of the state and to persecute the enemy. The perceived enemy, the immigrants, the black people. So that's why under Trump's rule, there were so many random killings of immigrants, of black people, and that's why armed white fascists and white nationalists, they went out to the demonstrations that we were having, and they tried to police the demonstrations, and they killed people who were protesting. So a new Trump presidency is going to threaten women, immigrants, black people, and organized gangs of white nationalists will feel empowered, and our lives will be at stake. I know that someone who's black American said that they are not vulnerable. Oh no, all people of color, everyone who's thought of as marginal, ethnically and racially, Muslims are going to be open season. So this is a huge threat, and that's the front lines. And then government will shut down our rights to protest. So this meeting, as Cliff said previously, will be endangered. We wouldn't be able to have this meeting. I'd like to not talk about Trump, because ultimately Trump is a symptom of a deeper problem. I think the reality check is who's behind Trump, and how is a Trump victory going to empower and embolden the millions of Americans who support Trump, right? That's the danger. The danger is not one man, although one man can do a lot of damage, and we saw what that damage looked like during the pandemic. I mean, 1 million Americans died in the United States during the pandemic because of the inability of his government to put a viable solution to this crisis. I'm not sure that Democrats would have fared a lot better, but we do have this example that 1 million people died in the United States. So let's talk about, like, why 1 million people? Why do millions of people support Trump in the land of the free? I think we have to go back to the definition of fascism, and why it emerges. It emerges because of an economic crisis that's deep and a sense of profound betrayal felt in the nation. And I think we need to talk about that profound betrayal because we never do. And that profound betrayal has been felt and experienced and lived by working class white people in America, who've been essentially demobilized. Their status has been dropped in the last 50 years, socially and economically, like the Titanic, in the absence of a left alternative to explain why they've fallen from grace, right? So the betrayal that white Americans, working class and middle class, have felt began with the long-term economic decline, a deep long-term economic decline that started in the 1970s. You might know about this, and the neoliberal regime that followed. So in the 1960s, there was an uprising all over the world, in the United States, in France, in Latin America. There was a war in Vietnam that the United States lost. And American capitalism began to decline in terms of its profitability. And the ruling class of the United States and the world needed to continue to make profits. And it continued to make profits on the backs of workers by cutting wages, eliminating unions, eliminating benefits like health care, which most Americans got before the 1970s through their employees, but also by privatizing public services like education, healthcare, etc. That's what is known as neoliberalism. So working class white folks who, think about it, in the 1950s and 60s became homeowners for the first time in America. They literally moved to the suburbs. They went on up. They benefited, it seemed, temporarily from American capitalism, and they were able to build their own communities separate from other people of color. These white villages that were pretty well off. All of this and their dreams for their families and their children collapsed because this long-term process of decline in the global economy and the domestic economy led to a decline in employment, wages, and union membership. I have to remind you that these white workers also carried with them a sense of greatness and invincibility. And that feeling of greatness that white workers had in the 1970s and 80s, not all of them, but a lot of them, was tied to the history of racial apartheid in the United States, residential segregation, that in this country, white Americans live apart from the rest of us. But this sense of greatness on the part of Americans, white Americans in particular, but also people of color, is hugely tied to the United States standing in the world as the top dog, right? So we have a sense of superiority in America because America is the most powerful nation in the world. All of that sense of superiority that white workers have collapses. And let me give you a sense of the statistics behind this. A Harvard economist writing in the early 1990s and studying what had happened to the American economy said that between 1973 and the late 1980s, there was a massive transfer of wealth in the United States from the bottom of society to the top. The biggest transfer of wealth that had happened in history without a revolution or a military coup. And in the United States, it happened without a fight. Are you guys with me? How did the ruling class accomplish such a feat to essentially pickpocket the pockets of working class people, white people, middle class people, people of color, without us fighting back? Well, they used anti-immigrant sentiment and crime policy to deflect attention from this massive robbery. If you look at what's happening in government in the 1980s and 90s, every policy presented by both Democrats and Republicans is anti-immigrant sentiment and crime. Let's build more prisons because the black people are the problem and the immigrants from Latin America are stealing our jobs. Since the North American Free Trade Agreement was signed in 1996, and as you know, the North American Free Trade Agreement essentially allowed American businesses to set up shop in Latin America and essentially deindustrialize the United States. That was the biggest betrayal for the working class. The automobile industry essentially moved to Latin America and Mexico after the North American Free Trade Agreement. Since then, Americans have lost 30 million jobs. And those jobs have not been replaced. They've been replaced with part-time jobs that have absolutely no benefits when Americans are looking for full-time jobs. The wages of white men with only a high school diploma declined by 9% between 1996 and 2014. This is not including the decline that happened from 1973 to 1996, which was pretty huge. So I'm just trying to give you a sense of what life looks like for a group of people that we don't necessarily talk about, who support Trump because our cities are so segregated. We don't live alongside white people, right? Unfortunately, in this country. I'm going to give you a sense of what that social injury looked like for Black Americans, other people of color, Latinos, women, the LGBTQ communities were doing better because the civil rights movement produced equality in American society. So we think. So they think, right? The fact is that the reason why we're not bitter is because people of color, Mexicans, Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, African Americans, have always lived in Depression-era conditions in our neighborhoods, in absolute poverty. So this is more of the same for us. In fact, before deindustrialization hit the white working class, it had already produced permanent unemployment in the cities among Puerto Ricans, Chicanos, Mexicans, and Black Americans. So the fact that it seemed that, oh, Obama is elected. Now Kamala Harris, all these people of color are in office. People of color are doing great now. They've risen on up as our fates have declined. That produced a social injury, what is known as a social injury among white workers, a perceived fall from the country's hierarchical racial ladder, which essentially establishes white supremacy. And this adds and added to the place of white Americans in their mind. The fact that their livelihood and their social standing seem to have been taken by undeserving people of color who are engaged in crime and raping women, as Trump suggested about Mexican men in the last election. So what that means is that this fall from grace that the white working class has experienced has been called a death of despair by researchers at Princeton University who call the drug overdoses that white people are experiencing across the country, the alcohol poisoning and the suicide at exponential rates. That's what they call these developments, deaths of despair, which also include, according to these Princeton researchers who are studying white workers and white people generally, this includes a slowdown in progress against mortality from heart disease and cancer, the two largest killers in middle age. That means that white men in particular are committing suicide in unprecedented numbers. And white people are dying more than people of color in some instances of heart disease and cancer before their time. So that's what the American dream means for so many white people in America. It also means that for us. But we never had the sense of entitlement, and we never had a sense that this country was ever going to deliver anything but a nightmare for us. And so it's this discontent and this despair that makes someone like Trump so popular among white Americans. He seems to be the answer to the tragedy that has become our lives. And it's an easy answer because what fascists do is that they scapegoat and blame the weakest link, the weakest and most downtrodden people in our society. I want to just, before we go further, the linchpin is this. Part of what I argue in this essay is that if fascism is distinguished from authoritarianism in that the state relies on armed bands of white citizens to carry out its interests, there has always been a threat of fascism in the United States. Why? Because in the early settler colonial history of this country, of the 1600s, the emerging colonial state, you know, the 13 colonies, made gun ownership the law among all European settlers. Why? The Second Amendment, gun ownership, was not something conferred onto Americans by the Revolution. It was something required of this settler colonial project because Native Americans fought back. And so this emerging state had to rely on settlers coming from Europe to arm themselves to help the emerging state protect its boundaries against Native American resistance and against slave rebellions. So that's bodies of armed men who are citizens that are being relied on by the state to carry out its interests. And then there are other instances throughout American history of the same tendency. You probably know something about the Mexico-US War of 1848, during which the United States acquired 55% of its territory from Mexico. All of these states, Arizona, California, Nevada, Montana, all of them were Mexican, right? And they were acquired by the United States through imperial war. What happened to the Mexicans who remained in these states, because that's where they lived? They were lynched by American citizens so that they wouldn't claim access and the right to the land that in fact belonged to them. That's another example of the state relying on armed citizens to carry out its interests against Mexicans in the aftermath of the Mexican-American War. During Reconstruction, after the Civil War, we see for the first time the emergence of the KKK, a terrorist organization armed that lynched the former enslaved Africans, so that the former enslaved Africans would be fearful enough and would submit their labor to a ruling class that was never eliminated. So that's another example. And if you look at all of American history, the state has always depended on armed white militias to carry out its interests. That means that fascism in the United States is not a pipe dream. It's always a possibility, a latent possibility in this country. In the 1930s, there was a depression. And ironically, fascism emerges in Europe, but it doesn't emerge in the United States. Why doesn't it emerge in the United States? It doesn't emerge in the United States because there was an organized, coordinated, revolutionary union movement that explained the world to workers. The problem is not the Mexicans and the blacks and the immigrants. The problem is our rulers and the captains of industry, who will do anything to take home profits, even if it costs us our lives. And the most epic union movement was built that averted fascism in this country. The only thing that will avert the re-emergence of fascism or its threat is a working class movement that teaches the working class, the white working class, the root causes of their betrayal. And that cannot happen and will not happen within the Democratic Party. If you think about what has happened in this country over the last 50 years, union halls are empty. In the middle of fucking nowhere, America, where they're most needed. Before the 1980s and 90s, white people probably had backward ideas, but they went to the union meeting, they talked to their guys, and they got a different understanding of the world. That doesn't exist anymore. So it is our responsibility to actually rebuild the movement of workers, a union movement, and a workers' party that will explain the deep crisis and despair that white Americans are experiencing, but that we are experiencing too, and that the entire world is living through. I'll end on this. There was deindustrialization in the United States, but there's also deindustrialization happening now in the third world, right? And And so the reason why there are immigrants flooding into our cities is because capitalism has created wars and deindustrial displacement everywhere. And where else are they going to go? But where they think they can survive. So if we think that our situation in the United States is a hellscape, tell that to the Syrians, and to the people from the Ukraine, and to the people from Palestine, and from the people from people coming from the Congo, who are dying en route to safe haven in Europe and America. These are people who are literally taking a path of death out of their countries and walking hundreds and hundreds of thousands of miles to get to safety. So that's why fascism is on the rise, not just in the United States, but around the world, because capitalism is in a crisis that it cannot contain. And what's happening in Palestine, the genocide that's happening in Palestine, is a taste of what the world is up against in the future. The Palestinians are being killed because their labor is not important. They're a marginal people, disconnected to industry in the global economy, so we can disappear them. But that's the case with people in the Congo. That's the case with many people here in the United States. That's why Bekele in Salvador has built a prison of 40,000 people. But that large-scale prison was first built in the United States. And now it's being exported all over the world, in India. So this is what the ruling class has in store for us. And what we need to do is wake up to the magnitude of the crisis that's going to destroy and devastate humanity on a scale unseen. And we've not even talked about the environment.
On this question of internationalism, part of what you're saying and illustrating is the profound creativity and knowledge and skill of workers around the world, regardless of nation. And that's ultimately what we need to amplify, rather than our nationalities. So I agree with the comrade who said that we should eliminate these walls. Human beings have been migrating on Earth since we left Africa. I mean, even within Africa, we were migrants. And I think that just having this discussion begins to educate us and raise the standards that we have for humanity. On this issue of internationalism, I mentioned the North American Free Trade Agreement and how that essentially led to the deindustrialization of American industry. But as you said, it also led to the displacement of Mexican agricultural workers and small farmers, which is why East Harlem, which was previously a Puerto Rican neighborhood, is now Mexican. And it's been Mexican since the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement because of displacement as a result of U.S. foreign policy. I wanted to just say that, and that's just one example. This is happening all over the world. Project 2025 proposes to end birthright citizenship. And I'll say this, birthright citizenship emerges out of the fight of Black Americans for citizenship and freedom in the aftermath of the Civil War. So this is not an attack against Chicanos and Mexicans and immigrants from Latin America. This is an attack on the most basic rights that Black Americans have fought for. The reason why citizenship right emerges is because before that in the United States, citizenship was tied to what? Property and land ownership. And this was a way to give voting power to enslaved Africans in the South after the Civil War. Ironically, the majority of people who benefited from birthright citizenship when it emerged after the Civil War were European immigrants whose children could now become Americans. So that birthright citizenship is part of a long struggle in this country to expand the meaning and definition of citizenship. And that's real. If Trump is elected, birthright citizenship in the United States is likely going to be gone. And that's going to be very dangerous because that can be rescinded many generations back, as we see in the Dominican Republic and Haiti today. So that's a real threat. I will say that the fascists in Germany in the early 1930s sent a delegation to the United States to study citizenship on the basis of race in the South and to study America's immigration policy, which excluded legally Chinese and a whole host of other people from being in the United States and from being immigrants. So there is something very there's a latent fascism in the United States that in fact the German Nazis came to study here. I just wanted to put that in there. Someone asked whether white Americans are a basket of deplorables that we must abandon, or whether there's a chance that we could bring them over to reality. I think that there are some people in this country who are not reformable. But I think the problem is that if a fascist movement consolidates power, there are a lot of people in the middle who are going to be influenced by that fascist movement. And historically, white Americans and white workers in this country have engaged in horrific acts of racialized violence and also heroic acts of solidarity with oppressed people. The IWW is responsible for incredibly courageous struggles alongside Black Americans, Native Americans, Mexican workers. What is determinative is the kind of leadership that's on the ground offering alternatives. I want to remind us that it was a very small number of Black Americans who rose up in the context of the George Floyd. The majority of people who fought against the lynching of George Floyd were white people in the Midwest. It's really crazy that we don't think of this. Yes, Black people rioted in Minneapolis, and that was critical. That turned the tide. But the vast majority of people who protested over and over were Midwesterners. They weren't even like people from the coasts. It was people in the middle of America, white people in the middle of America. And those people can go either way. So I think that there's a crisis of education in this country, a deep crisis of education. And you hear it when you listen to the MAGA people. But the evisceration of public education is part of the fascist project, it's part of the neoliberal project, and it's what keeps us divided. And it's our job to be the university of the working class. With our publications, with these meetings, it's the only way. And education is ultimately profoundly liberatory for everyone who studies even a little bit of the history of this country. The history of the First Amendment, how the First Amendment was won. It was white workers in Spokane, Washington, who were protesting an employment company's corruption that was charging $1 for getting workers employment. And then workers would get fired and they would have to pay another $1 to get a job. And workers started speaking out in Spokane against the employment company, and they got arrested because, of course, the employment company was in cahoots with the local government. And that's how the First Amendment, the free speech movement emerges in this country, by workers putting themselves out there and speaking truth to power in the public square. White workers. So I think there is a long history in this country. What is missing is leadership. And on that issue, I want to say that the CIO, the reason why the 1930s became a revolutionary moment in this country when labor was organized, is because there was, first of all, organized socialists and communists who led the union movement, but also there was a very deliberate discussion among labor leaders about a new strategy. The new strategy that had to be deployed in order to win against capital. And that was the widespread organizing of workers within an industry, in the automobile industry. Not by skill, but across industry. We need that kind of deliberate strategy on the part of labor leaders, whether in unions or not, in this period. The fucking working class in America, I don't know what the hell it looks like. We need to understand what the working class looks like. We need to understand how automation is going to destroy our lives very quickly, and figure out how to fight capital. But that can't happen with, we need people to come together. And this is the beginning of that coming together of socialists, communists, progressives, and union people, or labor, whether they're in unions or not.